all states, all unions, all polities are to some extent children of their time. This state has grown according to the DNA that was encoded in the late 1940s. Sadly, the European Union equally is a child of its time. Its founders had come through the terrible experience of the Second World War, and they were determined, above all else, above any other political objective, to prevent the outbreak of future wars in Europe. And that objective for them was more important than personal liberty or parliamentary democracy or keeping to their own rules. The method that they had determined on was to merge first the economies of the European nations and then their political systems so that future wars between them should become logistically impossible. But in order to do that, they had to sacrifice a measure of democratic accountability. They understood, Jean Monnet, Robert Schuman, the other founding fathers of the European Union, they understood, and they said very clearly at the time, that if every successive transfer of power from the nation states to Brussels was going to be referred back to the electorates for permission, it would never happen. This bold, ambitious, spirited scheme they had to create a single state out of all these ancient kingdoms and republics would never work if the system was a functioning democracy. And so they vested supreme power in the hands of 27 unelected European commissioners. They took the view that public opinion sometimes needed to be interpreted, moderated, tempered by a class of sober, wise technocrats. And so when Israeli politicians go with the old refrain, we're the one democracy in the Middle East, you know what? They're not interested in that argument. If anything, it slightly annoys them. They are, although the nation states may be democratic in themselves, the unit which they've created collectively is not. Let me put it another way. Right? You can infer a great deal about a country by looking at its foundational documents. So just for a second, compare and contrast the American Constitution to the European one, which came into force on the first day of last month. The US Constitution is 7,200 words long in my version, and that includes all 22 amendments. The European Constitution, now called the Lisbon Treaty, is 76,000 words long. The US Constitution concerns itself with broad principles, such as the relationship between federal and state authorities and so on. The European Constitution busies itself with such minutiae as space exploration, the rights of asylum seekers, the status of disabled people. There is nothing too small to have escaped its attention. The US Constitution came into effect following ratification by specially convened assemblies in the 13 member states. It came into effect after the first 11 of them, but the other two then came into effect, line afterwards. The European Constitution was put to referendums and rejected, first in France and then in the Netherlands and then in Ireland, but imposed anyway. I'm not joking when I make this point about absence of democracy. The European Union is in fact doing what all states and what all state systems do. It is exporting its ideology. The Jacobins did it when they declared war on the old monarchical system. The Soviet Union did it when it incited workers to revolt in every other country. The Iranian revolutionaries did it when they started sponsoring their militias and their terrorist organizations around the Middle East and in Asia. All countries do it, and the European Union is no exception. It exports the ideology of supranationalism, first of all, in the most literal sense, by incentivizing the creation of imitation European unions on other continents. So it has poured resources into encouraging federations in Central America, in South America, in Southeast Asia, and so on. If you look at an organization like Mercosur in South America, it isn't something that came about spontaneously out of discussions among the participating member states. It was completely sponsored and driven by the European Union. And in a way, when, it was almost, when the European Union was simply the friend and sponsor of the Palestinian cause, that was a less dangerous position, a less existential threat to the State of Israel than the current position of most of my MEP colleagues, which is, why don't they just go in with everybody else? Why don't they just sort of, drop all this obsession they have with national sovereignty? How absurd is it that we're tearing down the Berlin Wall in Europe and they're erecting this huge fence in Israel and so on? In other words, if you extend that logic, if you take the view that the Jewish nation should simply sort of dissolve itself happily with its surrounding neighbours, it seems to me that is a much more dangerous proposition from an Israeli perspective than simply one that tried to shrink the state or push it back to older borders. But as I say, they're at least being consistent. They're being completely honest and open in what they're doing. The most dangerous aspect of this, though, is not the money that they're putting into the Central American Parliament or the African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries. It's the way in which they are elevating the ideology of supranationalism to a global level. And the mechanism by which they're doing this is through international law. The creation and expansion of a corpus of supranational jurisdiction that is not rooted in any national legislature, in fact, is not the product of any democratic process whatever, but is rather the creature of a standing body of international human rights lawyers. It's a very recent and sudden development. It's stunning quite how quickly we've moved in how short a time. For hundreds of years, the phrase international law simply referred to how states relate to each other as legal persons. William Blackstone, the great British jurist, said international law comprises of three things: violation of safe conduct passes, treatment of ambassadors, and piracy on the high seas. That was what international law used to mean. Now, there was an expansion after the Second World War with the establishment of the United Nations and the Torture Convention and the Genocide Convention. But we have to be very careful to distinguish between international law as it was then and what it has become more recently. This point is worth stressing because supporters of a supranational legal system have, as they see it, an absolutely trump card up their sleeve, which is they can say, the system began with the Nuremberg Trials. Right? Therefore, no more opposition, please. How can anyone argue with that? The trouble is, it isn't really true. If you go back to the arguments that attended the creation of the International Tribunal at Nuremberg, they were not claiming a global jurisdiction for a new legal order. On the contrary, they were acting very consciously as the occupying power of Germany. In fact, the German authorities said, well, if this is going to be an international trial, we should have judges from non-combatant countries, from countries that were not involved in the recent war. And the Allies said, absolutely not. We are exercising our sovereign power as the government of Germany, which has fallen to us under the terms of the surrender and the occupation. In other words, it wasn't the creation of the corpus of international law that is often claimed now. And although, yes, there were UN conventions that were written in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, they were only binding on their signatories as states. The Torture Convention, the Genocide Convention, and so on. In other words, the only sanction was the disapprobation of other countries, or in extremis, the expulsion of that country from the United Nations. There was absolutely no sense of an overarching legal system that could, if you like, reach in to the nations, that could get in behind their borders and apply directly to individuals within them. To get to that, you have to go back only as far as the 1990s. This new concept of a new world order, of a supranational legal system which creates universal human rights that can then be directly interpreted and applied by an international body, has come about since and largely as a consequence of the end of the Cold War. A number of well-intentioned, idealistic jurists have pursued at international level an agenda that would not have got through national parliaments. Having lost at the ballot box, they have found a substitute way of pushing their agenda internationally.